The final sound she heard from the house she grew up in was the click of the latch. It was not a slam, not a crash of angry wood, but a quiet, metallic finality. Mr. Graves, the man who had married her mother and inherited everything upon her passing, stood on the other side of that door. He had pressed 18 silver dollars into her palm, one for each year of her life, and told her the world had no place for sentiment. His face, a mask of hard piety, showed no flicker of doubt. He was cleansing his home, performing an act of righteous, practical cruelty. Ilara stood on the porch, the 18 coins cold against her skin. She possessed the clothes she wore, a worn wool dress and thin shawl, a pair of sturdy boots, and a small canvas sack containing a loaf of bread, a whetstone, and a water-skin. And in her hand, a folded, brittle document. It was the deed to the only thing her real father had left her, a worthless scrap of land, high in the granite shoulders of the mountains, a place the townsfolk of Promise Creek called the Scab. It had been part of an old, failed mining claim, and the only structure on it was a derelict powder magazine, a stone bunker built into the hillside to store blasting powder. It was considered not just useless, but haunted and dangerous. The town watched. From behind lace curtains and through the glass of the mercantile, they saw the girl, not yet a woman, cast out. There was pity, of course, but it was a thin, watery thing. It was the pity one feels for a lamb with a cough, a thing already marked for its end. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped out onto his boardwalk, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man of pronouncements, his wisdom as cheap and plentiful as the penny candy in his jars. "A shame," he said, to no one and everyone. "The girl should head east, find work in a mill. No life for her here." She heard him. She heard the whispers that followed, the soft murmur of a community confirming its own judgment. She was an orphan, a stray, and now an outcast. They expected her to break. They expected tears, pleas, a collapse into the dust of the main street. But Ilara's grief for her mother was a cold, hard stone inside her, too heavy for tears. She looked at the 18 coins, not as an insult, but as a resource. It was all she had. She walked past Mr. Gable, her gaze straight ahead, and did not go east. She went into his store. The bell above the door chimed her entrance, a sound too cheerful for the moment. The whispers outside fell silent. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. She walked to the counter where Mr. Gable stood, his expression a careful blend of sympathy and impatience. She did not speak of her predicament. She did not ask for charity. She placed 4 of her silver dollars on the worn wood of the counter. "I need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a winter stream. "A felling axe, and a shovel." Gable blinked. He looked at the coins, then at her face. He saw no desperation, only a chilling resolve that unsettled him. This was not the part a pitiable orphan was meant to play. "An axe?" he repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Child, what use does a girl have for a felling axe?" He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "That land up there, there's nothing but rock and regret. You'd be better off buying a stagecoach ticket." "The axe," Ilara said again, her voice unchanged. She pushed the coins forward an inch. It was a transaction, not a negotiation. Defeated by her stillness, Gable sighed and retrieved a fine, sharp-headed axe from the back room, its hickory handle smooth and pale. He also produced a sturdy shovel with a steel spade. The tools were her last tie to this town, her final purchase from a world that had already written her off. With the axe balanced on one shoulder and the shovel in her other hand, she walked out of the store, leaving the bell to announce her departure. She did not look back. She turned her face toward the mountains and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. The road out of Promise Creek quickly dissolved into a rutted track, then a game trail that climbed relentlessly. The weight of the axe and shovel was a living thing, a biting presence that settled deep into her muscles. The sun beat down, and the thin mountain air sawed at her lungs. The landscape grew harsher, the gentle pines of the valley giving way to stark granite cliffs and wind-stunted junipers. This was land that tolerated life, but did not welcome it. By the second day, her bread was gone, and her water skin was nearly empty. Her hands were raw, her shoulders ached with a fire that never dimmed, and her feet were a geography of blisters. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of her own breathing and the cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent sky. She was utterly alone, a tiny speck of determined life in a landscape of stone and sky. She followed the crude map drawn on the back of the deed, her father's spidery handwriting a ghost from a life she barely remembered. She found it late in the afternoon of the third day. The trail ended at a wide, sloping field of scree, broken, sharp-edged rocks that had slid down from the cliff face above. And there, half buried in the rubble, was a squat, windowless structure of dark, fitted stone. Its heavy wooden door, bound with rusted iron straps, hung askew from a single, massive hinge. The earth had reclaimed much of it. The roof was a thick blanket of soil and hardy mountain grasses, making it look less like a building and more like a natural feature of the hill itself. This was the powder magazine. This was her inheritance. A wave of despair, cold and sickening, washed over her. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a shelter. It was a tomb. A hole. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. Her stepfather was right. This was a place to die. She slid to the ground, the shovel and axe clattering on the rocks beside her. The sheer, crushing hopelessness of it stole the air from her lungs. For a single, terrifying moment, she considered the long walk back, the humiliation of begging for a place at the church poorhouse. But the thought of their faces, their knowing pity, was a spur. She pushed herself to her feet, her jaw set. She had come this far. She would at least see the inside of her failure. Using the shovel as a lever, she pried at the massive door. It resisted, groaning as a decade of rust and neglect fought her. She threw her entire weight against it, her muscles screaming, until with a final, shuddering crack, the door scraped open just wide enough for her to slip through. She stepped from the bright, hot sun into a deep and profound darkness. The air was cool, still, and smelled of damp earth and stone. It was a silence deeper than the one outside, a heavy, pressing quiet. As her eyes adjusted, she saw she was in a single, cavernous room, perhaps 20 feet square. The walls were thick, meticulously fitted blocks of granite. The ceiling was a low arch of the same stone. There was no light, no life, just cold, dead stone. Then she felt it, a draft. But it was not a draft of cold air from the doorway. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible current of, not warmth precisely, but less cold air. It seemed to be coming from the back of the chamber. She moved deeper into the darkness, her hands trailing along the cold, rough wall, and then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it. Drip, drip, drip. A slow, rhythmic fall of water. In the far corner, a tiny, glistening bead of water emerged from a fissure in the rock, swelled, and fell to a small, damp patch on the floor. It was clean, clear, and constant. A spring, a year-round source of water, protected from the sun and the freeze, deep within the rock. She knelt and touched the stone wall around it. It was cool, but not the biting, icy cold of the surface rock outside. The immense thickness of the walls, the tons of earth piled on the roof. It was insulation. The powder magazine was a stone cave, harnessing the planet's thermal mass. In the brutal heat of summer, it would be cool, and in the killing cold of winter, it would hold its warmth against the frost. This was the secret. This was the hidden advantage. The worthless, dangerous hole in the ground was a fortress against the elements. The despair that had crippled her moments before evaporated, replaced by a grim, fierce resolve. The town saw a tomb. She saw a sanctuary. She walked back into the sunlight, her eyes blinking against the sudden glare. She picked up her axe. The work began. Her first task was to clear the entrance. For days, she moved rocks, one by one, her hands bleeding through the thin fabric of her dress, which she tore into makeshift gloves. She used the shovel to clear away the smaller scree, her back muscles burning with a pain that became a constant companion. She learned the leverage of the shovel, the balance of a heavy stone, the rhythm of labor that turned agony into a kind of numb purpose. Each cleared foot of ground was a victory. Next was the door. It was too heavy to fix alone, so she dismantled it. Using a rock as a hammer, she knocked the pins from the remaining hinge and let the massive slab of wood fall. She would build a new one, a lighter one she could manage. She found a stand of lodgepole pines in a sheltered hollow a quarter-mile away. Felling the first tree was a lesson in humility. The axe, so sharp and perfect in the store, felt awkward and alive in her hands. Her first swings were clumsy, glancing off the bark. But she learned. She watched how the blade bit, how the chips flew, how the tree groaned and listed before it finally fell with a ground-shaking crash that echoed through the silent hills. She spent a week felling and limbing trees, then hauling the logs back to her shelter. It was brutal, back-breaking work. She was not strong enough to lift them, so she learned to roll them, to use smaller logs as levers and fulcrums, to drag them with rope she fashioned from stripped bark. Her body was a tapestry of bruises and scratches. Her hands were a mess of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She ate wild berries and the tough roots of mountain plants she recognized from her mother's lessons. She grew leaner, harder. The soft girl who had left Promise Creek was being burned away, replaced by something forged in sweat and stone. With the logs on site, she began constructing a new door and a frame. She had no nails, so she learned to cut notches, to fit the logs together in a tight, interlocking pattern. She built a heavy cross brace and wove smaller branches between the logs, creating a dense barrier. It was crude, but it was strong. For hinges, she carved 2 heavy, hook-shaped pieces of hardwood and corresponding sockets in the stone doorframe, lubricating them with goat tallow she would later acquire. Hanging it was a monumental effort of leverage and prayer, but when it was done, she had a door she could open and, more importantly, bar from the inside. Her attention then turned to the interior. The stone walls were solid, but over the years, some of the mortar had crumbled, leaving small gaps. The wind would find those gaps in winter. She needed to chink them. She found a deposit of clay near the spring's overflow, and she spent days mixing it with dried grasses and water, pounding it with a rock until it had the consistency of thick dough. She pushed this primitive mortar into every crack and crevice, smoothing it with her calloused palms. It was slow, tedious work, but with each sealed gap, the shelter became more and more her own, a space defined not by what it was, but by what she was making it. Heat was the next challenge. A fire inside a stone box with no chimney was a death sentence. She searched the interior for any sign of a vent, and she found it. High up in the arched ceiling, almost invisible in the gloom, was a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock, no wider than her hand. Looking up, she could see a tiny pinprick of daylight. It was a natural chimney, a flaw in the stone that went straight up through the hill. She built her fireplace directly beneath it. She hauled flat stones from the scree field and built a raised hearth, then a C-shaped wall of rock around it to direct the heat out into the room. Her first fire was a miracle. She laid small sticks of kindling, struck a spark with a piece of flint and the steel spine of a small knife she owned, and held her breath as a tiny flame flickered to life. The smoke, thin and gray, wavered for a moment, then was drawn upward, disappearing into the fissure. It worked. The smoke rose, invisible, dissipating high on the empty hillside. That night, for the first time, she slept in warmth, the soft orange light of the fire dancing on the stone walls of her fortress. It was the first true home she had ever known. With shelter, water, and heat secured, she turned to food. She had her father's small knife, and she learned to carve snares, placing them on the rabbit trails that crisscrossed the hillside. Her first catch felt like a feast, but she needed more. She needed a sustainable source of food for the long winter ahead. Inside the magazine, the temperature was constant, but it was dark. She needed soil and a sliver of light. She spent 2 weeks hauling soil. With her canvas sack and the shovel, she made dozens of trips to a meadow in the hollow, digging up the rich, black earth and carrying it, 50 pounds at a time, back to her shelter. Inside, she built 3 long, low-walled garden beds out of flat stones. She filled them with the precious soil. For light, she used the shovel and a sharpened pole to laboriously carve a small opening in the thick earthen roof near the front wall. She framed it with wood, and on her next trip to town would buy a small pane of glass to cover it, creating a tiny, insulated skylight. For now, it was an open hole that let in a shaft of pale, life-giving light. Weeks had passed since she had left Promise Creek. Her remaining $14 felt heavy in her pocket. It was time to return. The walk back was different. She was stronger, her body hardened by labor. The trail seemed shorter, the hills less daunting. When she walked down the main street of Promise Creek, her axe on her shoulder, a hush fell. She was thinner, her face browned by the sun, her dress stained and patched, but she walked with a purpose that silenced the usual gossip. She went straight to the mercantile. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, and his jaw dropped when he saw her. He had expected to hear she had died or given up. He had not expected this. "Good heavens, child," he stammered. "You're alive." "I need 3 laying hens, a nanny goat, one that's been bred, and a pane of glass," she said, her voice steady. She placed her remaining coins on the counter. "And whatever seeds you have for root vegetables, carrots, turnips, potatoes." Gable stared at her, then at the money. The mockery returned to his eyes, now mixed with a grudging disbelief. "Hens? A goat? Up at the powder hole?" He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "What are you building up there, girl? Noah's Ark? Animals need a barn. They'll freeze solid come first frost." He shook his head, already crafting the story he would tell later. "They call you the Folly Girl, you know. Living in a hole in the ground with a goat." "I have a place for them," Elara said simply. She gathered her purchases. The seeds, the precious pane of glass wrapped in cloth. He helped her tie the legs of the squawking chickens and handed her the rope for the goat, a placid animal with a swelling belly. The entire town watched as the Folly Girl, with her axe and her livestock, walked back out of town and up into the mountains. The journey back was a chaotic, slow-moving procession, the goat bleating, the chickens struggling. But she managed. She was not just surviving, she was building. Back at the magazine, she partitioned off a corner of the large room with a low stone wall, creating a pen for the animals. The goat and chickens would live inside with her, their body heat adding to the warmth of the shelter, their presence a comfort in the immense solitude. She installed the pane of glass in her skylight, sealing it with more clay mortar. A soft, filtered light now fell upon her garden beds. She planted her seeds, her fingers deep in the dark, cool earth she had carried on her back. One evening, as she was cooking a rabbit over the fire, a new sound came from the darkness outside. A low whine. She unbarred the door to find a dog, a scruffy collection of bones and matted fur, its ribs stark beneath its hide. It was starving and terrified, but it didn't run. It just watched her, its amber eyes filled with a deep and weary caution. She tossed it a piece of meat. It snatched it from the air and vanished. But the next night it was back, and the night after that. Slowly, she earned its trust. She named him Boulder for his stillness and the color of his coat. He became her shadow, her guard, her only companion. At night, he slept by the fire, his warm body a solid, living presence against the cold stone floor. As autumn painted the mountains in hues of gold and rust, the mockery from the town solidified into a local legend. Hunters who passed near her claim would report seeing smoke that seemed to rise from the ground itself, and spoke of the strange girl who lived with her animals in a cave. The name Powder Keg Kate stuck, a cruel joke about her precarious existence. Mr. Graves, her stepfather, when asked about her, would simply shake his head with performative sadness, saying he had done all he could for the willful, foolish girl. Ilara was oblivious to most of it. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of her homestead. Her days were a cycle of relentless, meaningful work. At dawn, she would let the animals out to forage under Boulder's watchful eye. She would check her snares, milk the goat, and collect the single, precious egg from her hens. She tended her subterranean garden, watering the pale green shoots that pushed up through the soil. Most of her time, however, was spent on firewood. She knew winter was not just a season here, it was a predator. She felled tree after tree, sawed the logs into rounds with a bucksaw she'd bought with eggs traded to a passing trapper, and split them with her axe. She stockpiled the wood inside the magazine, stacking it against an entire wall until it reached the ceiling. It was a bulwark of fuel, a fortress of warmth. Winter sent its scouts in early November. A wet, heavy snow fell for 2 days, and the temperature plummeted. A leak she had missed in the earthen roof began to drip near her sleeping pallet. In the freezing rain, she was outside, scrambling onto the roof, packing more clay and sod into the weak spot until it held. It was a warning. A few nights later, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled the magazine. Their howls were a chilling symphony just outside the door. Boulder stood bristling, a low growl in his chest, as Ilara sat with the axe across her lap, listening to the scratching and sniffing at the heavy wood. But the door held. The stone walls were impassive. The wolves eventually moved on, and in the morning all that was left were their tracks in the snow. Her systems were working. She was safe. The deep winter arrived not as a gentle blanket, but as a hammer. It was the blizzard the old-timers would later call the Great White Death of '83. It began with a wind that screamed like a banshee, a physical force that tore at the very trees. Then came the snow. It was not a gentle falling, but a horizontal, blinding torrent of ice and flakes. The world outside her door vanished, replaced by a churning, white chaos. The temperature dropped to a level that was no longer just cold, but an active, malevolent presence that sought to steal the life from any living thing. Inside the powder magazine, there was calm. The wind howled and shrieked high overhead, but it could not touch her. The tons of earth and snow on her roof were the greatest insulation imaginable. The stone walls, now thoroughly warmed by weeks of fire, radiated a gentle, steady heat. The fire in her hearth burned brightly, its smoke drawn cleanly up the hidden fissure. The goat, whose belly was now large with kids, chewed its cud contentedly. The chickens roosted, occasionally clucking. Boulder dozed by the fire. Ilara sat mending a tear in her shawl, the rhythmic pass of the needle a small, peaceful sound in her warm, well-lit world. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a maelstrom of death. Inside, an ordered, quiet life. In Promise Creek, it was apocalypse. The town was not built for such a storm. The conventional wooden houses, with their drafty walls and exposed roofs, were no match for the fury. The wind ripped shingles away like peeling bark. The snow, heavy and wet, accumulated in massive drifts, then in thick, crushing layers. The roof of the livery stable was the first to go, collapsing with a sound like thunder, killing half a dozen horses. Then the meeting hall's roof cracked, great timbers groaning under a weight they were never meant to bear. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the cracks around windows and doors, but the cold was a relentless intruder. It found every weakness. Firewood, stacked neatly in woodsheds or against the sides of houses, was buried under 10 feet of snow. What little wood people had inside dwindled rapidly. The cold was a thief, stealing heat faster than any fire could produce it. Livestock in barns froze where they stood. Mr. Graves lost nearly 100 head of cattle, their frozen forms becoming strange, silent statues in the fields. The town's confidence, its belief in its own sturdy permanence, was shattering. On the third day of the blizzard, a frantic, muffled banging echoed through Ilara's shelter. It was a sound so alien in her solitary world that she froze, her needle poised in midair. Boulder was on his feet instantly, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. The banging came again, more desperate this time, accompanied by a faint, hoarse shout. She grabbed the heavy bar from her door, her heart pounding. Who could possibly be out in this? She heaved the door open a crack. A figure, more a sculpture of snow and ice than a man, stumbled forward and collapsed into her shelter. It was Mr. Gable, the store owner. His face was a waxy, dead-white mask of frostbite, his beard frozen into a solid chunk of ice. He lay on her floor, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. She and Boulder dragged him closer to the fire. She forced the door shut against the raging storm and barred it. She worked quickly, cutting away his frozen outer clothes. She rubbed his hands and feet with snow to bring the feeling back slowly, a painful but necessary remedy. After a few minutes, he could speak, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "My boy," he gasped. "My youngest. The fever. Our fire is out. No more wood. The house. It's as cold as a grave." He looked at her, his eyes, once so full of mockery, now swimming with desperate, pleading terror. "Please, we'll die." Ilara looked at the man who had named her the Folly Girl, who had led the chorus of dismissal. She remembered his smug chuckle, his condescending advice. A bitter satisfaction could have been hers. She could have told him it was his own foolishness, his own lack of preparation, that had brought him here. She could have let him freeze. But looking at his broken face, she saw not her tormentor, but a father terrified for his child. The choice was not a choice at all. She had built this world not to gloat, but to live, and life helped life. She stood and went to her great wall of firewood. She packed a small sled she had built for hauling wood, loading it with dry, split pine and oak. She added a bundle of dried herbs her mother had taught her were good for breaking fevers. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak she had sewn from rabbit pelts and pulled on thick mittens. She handed a rope to Gable. "You will follow me," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Do not let go of the rope." They plunged back into the storm. It was like stepping into another world, a howling white void. She tied one end of the rope to the shelter's doorframe and the other around her waist. She gave the sled's pull rope to Gable. With Boulder barking ahead of them, his form barely visible, they moved into the teeth of the gale. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from their feet. The snow was so deep it was like wading through sand. But Ilara knew the land. She felt the slope, the placement of the rocks beneath the snow. She was a part of this mountain now, and it guided her. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world was silent, white, and unrecognizable. A rescue party from the town, led by a grim-faced Mr. Graves, was organized to check on the outlying homesteads. They assumed they were looking for bodies. Their last stop was the Scab, the powder magazine. They expected to find the Folly Girl frozen solid in her hole. They spent 2 hours digging through a massive snowdrift that had completely buried her door. When they finally broke through, they were met not by death, but by a wave of warm, food-scented air. They stared, dumbfounded. Ilara stood in the soft glow of her fire, a bowl of stew in her hands. The room behind her was a scene of impossible survival. A goat placidly watched them. Chickens scratched in a clean pen, and on stone shelves, jars of preserved berries and vegetables stood in neat rows. Most shocking of all were the garden beds, where the pale green leaves of turnips and carrots pushed defiantly from the black soil. It was warm. It was orderly. It was alive. The men stood in stunned silence, their own faces gaunt from cold and hunger. They looked from the impossible scene before them to the harsh, frozen world they had just come from. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This was not a story of a foolish girl in a cave. This was a testament to a wisdom they had not only failed to see, but had actively mocked. Mr. Graves stepped forward. He was a man accustomed to power, to being right. But the evidence before him was irrefutable. He looked at his stepdaughter, this girl he had cast out with 18 silver dollars. He saw the strength in her face, the quiet competence in her eyes. He saw the world she had built from nothing but his scorn and a worthless piece of rock. His pride, the foundation of his entire being, crumbled. "We were wrong," he said, his voice hoarse. "My God, girl, I was wrong." Ilara simply nodded. She held out the bowl of stew to him. "There is food," she said. "Eat." She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology. Her victory was not in their shame, but in the simple, undeniable fact of the warm stew, the breathing animals, the living plants. She had not built her shelter to prove them wrong. She had built it to live, and now she would share that life. In the weeks that followed, the powder magazine became the heart of the recovery. Ilara shared her firewood, her preserved food, the milk from her goat. The people of Promise Creek, humbled and grateful, came not with mockery, but with offerings, tools, salt, cloth, and most of all, respect. The nickname, Powder Keg Kate, was still used, but now it was spoken with a tone of awe, a name for the woman who held the spark of life when the whole world tried to freeze. The great blizzard changed Promise Creek forever. The following spring, men came to Ilara's shelter not to laugh, but to learn. They studied her stone walls, her earthen roof, her clever chimney. They saw how she had used the land itself as a shield. New homes in the valley began to be built differently, with thicker stone foundations, with cellars dug deep into the earth, with a respect for the unforgiving power of the winter. Her methods, born of desperation and ingenuity, became the new wisdom. Ilara never left her mountain. Her home grew, but its heart remained the stone magazine. She acquired more land, more animals. She never married, but she was never alone. Boulder stayed by her side until he was old and gray, and the children of the town, including Mr. Gable's son, whom she had saved, would make the trip up the mountain to hear her stories and share her quiet warmth. She became a fixture, a landmark, as solid and enduring as the granite hills she called home. Years later, an old woman with hands as tough as leather and eyes as clear as the mountain sky, she would often stand at her doorway and look down at the lights of Promise Creek twinkling in the valley below. She had been cast out with nothing, given a place meant for explosives and to spare. They had given her a pile of rocks and expected her to die. Instead, she had built a life. She had learned that true strength was not in what you owned or the power you wielded, but in the quiet, relentless work of your own two hands. It was the understanding that the most valuable things are often hidden in the places no one else thinks to look, and that grace is not about having the last word, but about offering a warm bowl of stew to the very people who left you for dead in the cold.